spring is in the air, and spring historically generally marks when military campaigns start as troops march through the snow. As cooks, spring is usually when fresh ingredients start to become available again. Today, we're going to be looking at medieval Armenia and looking at the different ingredients that would have been arriving as various armies tried to conquer Armenia during the medieval period. Food is arguably the most important resource in Age of Empires 2, but all we see in game is just a single set of numbers. Throughout this series, we will be diving in to see exactly what foods each civilization prepared and ate, and how well I can recreate these recipes. This is Meals of Empires. So the Armenians as a civilization started way before the medieval period. They were already a great empire in antiquity, but once the medieval period did arrive, they were kind of hemmed in. There was the Black Sea, the Georgians in the Caucasus Mountains, the Caspian Sea, the Persians, the Muslims, and the Byzantines, so penned in from all sides. Obviously, this gives some influence to the cuisine during the medieval period, but most of the ingredients, as I've repeated many times during this series, were already present prior to the arrival of the medieval period. But these dishes would have developed during the medieval period as spices became more available, as trade continued to increase, as populations continued to increase. So the dishes we have today are a lavash, which is a flatbread historically well known for being Armenian, though there's different varieties that we'll touch on in the general region. Then we have Mshosh, which is actually the name for apricots in Armenian, but it refers to a dish with apricots and lentils mixed together somewhere in between like a salad and a stew. And then we're going to have some grilled eggplant and grilled asparagus. Let's get started with the cooking. So here is our mixing bowl to start our lavash. Here is our pre-ferment. This is a mixture of a sourdough starter that has been fed this morning about, I'd say 4 or 5 hours ago. And so in there we have 60 grams of our sourdough starter, 60 grams of wheat flour, and 60 grams of water. So 60, 60, 60. Into our dough, we're going to add 240 grams of wheat flour, and 200 grams of water. So we are starting with this because we'll allow the dough to rise a little bit while we're working on the other ingredients. So this is water that's been boiled. It's the equivalent of my filtered water. So there's our 240 grams of flour. Add in our water. Given how much Armenians migrated based off conflicts in medieval Anatolia, either west towards Constantinople or south towards the Levant region, it can be expected that lavash spread as well. The mixture that contains yeast comes in many forms and has been given many names, such as levain, pulish, and bigja, and Armenians refer to it as atikamor. So I'll mix all of this together. I just need one last ingredient that I regularly forget, and that is our salt. There we go, 5 grams of salt. So my kneading method is to start with wet hands, and I try to scoop up the bottoms of my dough off of the bottom of the container. And then, oh, this is just so liquid though. It's very, very hydrated. I'm just gonna mix it in the bowl and just pull it back and slap it back down for 5 minutes. I know this makes a riveting stream. Lavash would have historically been cooked in a tandoori, which is like a subterranean oven. Not something that I have in this building, unfortunately. The tandoori oven is just so hot because it's so well insulated, being underground. And they usually just take a little bit of water or whatever moisture is already in the dough, and that allows it to stick to the side of the oven. And then another way of cooking it in the modern sense is to actually flip a wok upside down. So like imagine I use this bowl and I flipped it upside down, and then I had the fire coming to the outside, or I guess from the inside of the wok now. And that would be a way to cook it. So I'll set that aside and get started on the Mshosh, onion and garlic to start us off with our aromatics. Since we're back towards the Mediterranean, we can go back to olive oil as our oil of choice to start our sauté. So the Armenians were well known during the medieval period as being one of the easternmost Christian civilizations. And so one of their main allies was the Byzantines, but because the Byzantines were dealing with so many of their own problems, they weren't necessarily there to help all the time. But the Armenians did build a ton of churches, and the city Ani was known as the City of 1001 Churches. It was almost like a fortress city situated between two rivers, and it was present in the 400s, but by the turn of the millennium in 1064, the Seljuks, the Turks that were descending from Turkmenistan down to Anatolia, sacked it, and then it was sacked by the Mongols in 1236, then it was shook by an earthquake in 1319, and then you have Tamerlane of the Tatars who captured it, and by then it was pretty much completely decimated, and now it is no longer inhabited. Next ingredient will be our garlic. So we start with the Kingdom of Great Armenia, which is prior to the medieval period, but went from the Caucasus Mountains and from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea. Then in 387, there was the partition of Eastern Armenia under the Sassanid Empire, which are the early Persians, and Western Armenia under the Byzantines, who were, at that point were still part of the Holy Roman Empire. Then in 645, the Muslims took control of Armenia, the beginning of the Muslim expansion throughout the Middle East, and then further east into Persia. Then in 885, we have the first Armenian-controlled empire, with the Bagratuni family taking over rule. And that's when the capital was moved to Ani, the city of 1001 churches. And then in 1045, Armenia fell to the Byzantines, but the Armenians were able to find a refuge in 1080, forming the Kingdom of Cilicia. And the location is just north and a little bit west of Syria. So right where Anatolia meets the Levant region, the little armpit of the Mediterranean. The kingdom grew because it was able to support the Christian crusaders that were looking to claim land in the Levant or Holy Land. So there was a good deal of mixing of Western and Eastern culture during the Crusades. And then in 1241, the Mongols arrive in Anatolia and completely take over Cilicia. And so the second kingdom or empire of the Armenians falls. So the onions are browning very nicely. There goes the garlic in as well. I'm going to turn the pot down a little bit while the aromatics continue to saute. I don't want any of them to burn. Next ingredient will be our apricots. Apricots were originally thought to have originated in the Caucasus in Armenia, and the name went from there to the Greeks, down to the Middle East, to the Muslims, went all around North Africa up to Spain, and then kind of went back towards Greece, Italy, Germany, France, and then to England, where it went into English. So a big journey for the apricot to go all the way around and get its English name. For the apricots, I'm just going to, I think, just cut them into quarters, and they're in the rose family, along with prunes. They're in the same genus as prunes, prunus, and they have kernels, which are a decent source of oil, though I don't know how many different cultures were actually using that as their oil source. Apricot kernels are also used in modern cosmetics as an exfoliant. Mshosh is the name of the dish, and it's also the Armenian name for apricots. And so this ends up being somewhere between a stew and a salad, depending on how you want to prepare it. We're going to put it a little bit closer to the stew side, just because I wanted to saute the ingredients, and a stew is a natural progression from this point, just adding water to allow things to finish cooking now that they've developed a lot of the flavors. So we'll start with some cumin. Not too much. Not as much as I would for a larger dal dish. Then we're going to go to fennel, also found along the Mediterranean. And the last one to grind up a little bit first is our fenugreek. Fenugreek has a bit of a maple syrup flavor that I think will go well with the licorice kind of flavor of the fennel. And then the cumin is more of an earthy flavor, bringing it all home with the earthy flavor of the lentils we'll add next. So these are called beluga lentils. They're a black lentil that's maybe a little bit smaller, but they're called beluga because they're supposed to be similar to beluga caviar. Yeah, for this dish you could use black lentils, green lentils, red lentils, pretty much any lentil that you can get your hands on. I would just say go with that. Mainly the apricots are going to be providing the flavor, and any lentil will give a little bit of an earthy flavor to the overall dish. The biggest difference, I guess, is that red lentils will break down a little bit more than these black lentils will. So we'll stick with these. To this, I'm going to add 2 cups of water. Look at all that browning coming off the bottom now as we add the water. Yummy. And we can add more water later as the lentils expand. All right, first trivia question. How did the Levant and Anatolia regions get their name? And I'll give you a hint, they both reference the same concept. Levain, the sourdough starter we're using for the lavash, and Levant both come from the same Latin root, levare, which means to rise. So in the case of the levain, our sourdough starter, that's the yeast rising as it, or causing a rise as it ferments and forms those air bubbles. And in the case of the Levant region, that's on the east side of the Mediterranean where the sun rises. And in terms of Anatolia, same thing, but instead of coming from Latin, we're coming from Greek. And that's referencing the Greek root anatello, which means to rise, and Anatoli, which is just the word for east. So Anatolia just is the east lands, so to speak. So next up is our grilled veggies. We're going to have our aubergine or eggplant. This is just the common variety that was found more in the Middle East and then into Europe as the Arabs or Muslims spread it. And then we're going to have our asparagus, which would have been growing all over Europe and Asia, often in salty soils that other plants couldn't handle. And we discussed these when we talked about the Sicilians. We're going to be cooking them a little bit differently, though, than when we did the Sicilians. It was more of a braise. Now it's going to be a grill. We're going to try to cook these as quickly as possible and have a lot of heat coming from the top as well. So this would be more similar to just cooking something in either a very hot oven or closer to a fire, where you might have some scorch marks creating a little bit of a char. So we're just going to do little rounds, maybe like a centimeter. In Armenian cooking, there's a lot of rehydrating. So you have a lot of ingredients that are drier, like our apricot, and sometimes lavash is allowed to dry out before being consumed, and it'll just store very well, which helps in times of hardship that you always have food available. But with our veggies, we're going to use similar concept of just hydrating them a lot before we grill them. When we did the Sicilians, we mentioned that you can snap an asparagus and kind of get the idea of what part you should toss because it's a little bit too hard. Well, this is soak for another 5 minutes or so. We can check on our lentils, see how they're progressing. Look at that color, quite nice. The beluga lentils have lost a little bit of their black pigmentation, and they're getting a little bit closer to brown now. We can turn back to the Mshosh for a moment to put in our other ingredient. These would be coming more from Persia, whereas the apricots would have been already present in Armenia during the medieval period. If I added the walnuts too early, they might have burned. There is our crushed walnut that we can throw in amongst the Mshosh. Water and oil don't mix super well, but hopefully there's enough that'll coat on top of these asparagus all the same. Make sure there's plenty of hot air circulating around the eggplant. That's the key. And I'll check on them in about 20 minutes. So we're going to get a really nicely floured surface to make our lavash or roll it out. The fermentation, I think, is more to give it some flavor rather than to really get it to rise. I might just make a mess here. And keep your eyes peeled on what I'm doing here, because there's a good chance I just make a complete mess and this turns into another one of the disasters I can add to the disaster list. I think the problem with continually adding flour here is the flour takes a while to be hydrated, so the flour is not really taking up the extra moisture that's in this mixture. While the lavash is cooking slowly on the pan, we can do the second trivia question. What shoots an arrow further? A longbow, a composite bow, or a crossbow? The answer of which can shoot further is the composite bow. And it can shoot both further and faster than the other bows, since it's a more efficient transfer of energy. The composite bow is a bow made out of multiple materials, hence the name composite. But to get that shape, you can't just have a simple stave of wood like what a longbow has that you can just make in a day. Instead, you're using a combination of wood, animal horn, sinew to create this composite of materials that can be very strong and also very snappy, have that flexibility that you want. The wood of the stave and the horns and the sinew are glued together using a glue made from animal tissue, specifically collagen. The word collagen comes from the Greek word for glue, which is kala. All right, I think we successfully recovered, and this will not go in the list of tragedies. but we added a bunch more flour. Now it's a little bit on the floury side, so Abby might take that against me on the execution, but at least we have a lavash that we can present with dinner to our judge. There's the eggplant done. It has some nice coloration. When the asparagus will turn back on to grill a little bit longer. It's time to give our lentil Mshosh a try. I already like the apricot flavors a little bit better than the pomegranate flavors that we have in the Persian cooking. I think they pair a little bit easier with the earthy flavors of the lentils. Don't rip on me. There we go. Just massaging this wider and wider with my fingers is a lot easier than rolling it, just because of how sticky it is. And you almost want to just toss it onto the pan immediately rather than put it down onto any surface. And I'm just lightly pulling the edges away because that's where a lot of the dough will build up, is along the edges. The only downside to our lavash is I haven't really seen any bubbling, but I think it's just that we're not getting it warm enough, unfortunately.
Hey, this looks edible.
Abby, what we have here is our Mshosh, which is the Armenian word for apricots. Lentils are beluga lentils, little black lentils that have turned brown as they cooked. Onions, garlic, fennel, fenugreek, cumin. Here we have our lavash. It is our flatbread that is yeasted with sourdough. Here we have some grilled veggies, our eggplant, and our asparagus. I would say start with the stew, and then you can add the bread in, dip it in, have a little veggie as a side as you want.
It's sweet. I don't like the flavor.
Okay.
But it's fine. It's interesting.
Like the apricot flavor, you think you don't like?
I don't like any of the flavors.
Really? I thought you might like this because it's sweet, and you have a sweeter tooth than I do.
I liked it at first.
Mm-hmm. You think it might be spices?
The other spices that were in there,
mm-hmm.
I did not like.
It's not like it's too close to dessert, right? It's just...
No.
Okay.
I don't know. There's just something about the flavor that I don't like.
Mm-hmm. Execution score?
7.
7? Should you serve this to your girlfriend?
No.
No.
Not this, not this. I would eat this if I were starving, which I kind of am. 3.5.
3.5 on should you serve this to your girlfriend. Okay. It's very sweet. The sweetness is what hits you first, and then you get some of the apricot flavors and some of the spices. The cumin I said was very strong when I was first cooking it, and now it's mostly like the fennel and the fenugreek flavors that come through a little bit more. I think it might be the fenugreek that Abby is... I don't know. It's either the fenugreek or the apricot is my guess on what the flavor is that Abby doesn't like as much. But I'm going to try it with the lavash. Just dip it in. It actually reminds me a little bit of when we did the Romans and we had the fig paste on I think we had it on a flatbread. Lavash takes a little bit more experience, I would say, than other breads. It's both crispy and a little bit chewy at the same time, which I think is a nice mixture. The problem was just that I made my dough too wet at the beginning. I think the recipes that I was using as a guide were not using a ferment or a levain that was as hydrated as mine. So the overall dough that I made was more hydrated than what is recommended. Soaking the eggplant or aubergine and our asparagus kind of worked out, I would say. It's just that the flavors are a little bit bitter. Some people like that. Abby is definitely in the camp that doesn't like that. That's the Armenians in a nutshell, an apricot kernel, if you will. Next week, I'll be casting the Garrison from Thursday through Sunday, so we will not have a cooking stream. And then the week after that, we will have the Britons. So stay tuned. Go ahead and like, subscribe, share with your friends. And until next time, I will see you in the comments.